So thank you, Roshan, inviting me to be part of this discussion as well as to share some of my thoughts with the most. I hope most of the students, those who are either in part of formal education or otherwise. Also, I'm happy to listen Nouri after a long time. It's good to listen to her research work and how it has been progressed and how much we could learn from her research also, because it's one of the very interesting research and nowhere we've seen, because perhaps a new kind of field now some of our students are working on. This also would reveal what extent the kind of problems which we are going to encounter in the future of education. Right. So having said so, I would take a different turn about this kind of problem, because to my mind, when I was listening Nuria, uh, one of my assumption, is that coaching industry appears to be almost like a shortcut method for many of the parents, if not the students. But now it's almost become almost like a parallel to formal education institutions, because the level of intensity expansion of these coaching centers across India in many cities now picking up, largely even in Bihar also. Patna, recent study also showed that the Patna city also growing, right? Lot of demand for coaching industry, it seems. Therefore, to my mind, it's all, if at all we do a extensive study on the growth rate of these institutions, the coaching study centers, I think it would be going to become almost parallel, right? So we don't have a very comprehensive study on how this new pattern is emerging out here. Despite the fact that this is growing, but there is a deeper psychological impact on how the parents and students are looking at the problem of largely the so-called education itself. Therefore, what I think that I would also think about what actually education all about, right? What is meant to be educated, and what actually the state or the agencies are supposed to be giving education to the citizens at large, what they're actually doing for the larger, the so-called the demographic dividend that is large in number, perhaps largest in the world, because India is a very youngest population. Therefore, it is going to be much more challenging for us to deal with this growing demographic dividend and how we are going to use this dividend for economic growth. Right? Therefore, per se, education is very important, but how the state as well as the so-called policy think tank think about education, because largely the way education is shaping is either by the think tanks, either the things are not only in India, but also there are many think tanks involved in this very complicated domain as far as the policy shaping is concerned, because of the global forces as well as the political economy. Second one, I was also looking at the parental perception and how parents are also constrained by many of the factors which are actually leading to complicate the way we understand education. Right. So given the deeper psychological ramifications on the student's life, recently I have come across a study. It is an extensive study and it's also intensive study on how the suicide tendency growing among the students. And the report suggests that across every state, the tendency of the students committing suicide is also growing, but also suicide rates also growing. Right? Last 5 years, this study recently came out. Last 5 years, the rates of suicide rates have grown up, as well as the tendency of committing suicide also growing up. Right? And astonishingly, very progressive state like Kerala, the study also shows that highest number. So there is a tendency of youth to commit suicide, right? And then the rate of suicide also largely high in the state of Kerala. Therefore, This is also one of the way look at how students are also pressurized, psychologically implicated because of the new domain called education and the new system of education that actually somehow commercializing. At the same time, it's also putting a lot of pressure on the educated lot, right? Because what Ruria is saying, the choices, we think that the choices because of the rational, we being a rational individuals, we could get some kind of a logical signals to what are the major decisions we have to take in the longer run as well as the immediate gratification, right? Certainly, taking up any coaching institution for their studies to looking at how they can get into admission in of the most of the prestigious institutions, thereby creating a new pathway for their life in the future, right? This kind of a perception is also somehow, I think, a myth has been created, right? For instance, there's a lot of idea like success. So you go to any advertisement, there is a word, there is a category called success. Success lies in this particular institute, or success lies in this type of coaching, right? Or branding of the coaching institution, so on and so forth. Everywhere you see the success. So there is a myth has been created in the mind of the public that the success lies with the, say, may not be coaching per se, to my mind, largely education, right? Education is going to create a success in our life. Or sometimes it also feel that if you are more economically well off, this also somehow pay well on to make your success through the channel called education. There are different dimensions to understand how this success played out in the life of the children, the students, at the same to also create a deep psychological impacts. Therefore, the recent study also show that there are tensions created by the existing structures, and therefore I would be briefly looking at how a system over a period of time created a constraint on the mind of the youth, especially on the educated youth. Right. I would paraphrase this entire constraint into a ecology of disaster. Right. And then I would also go on to describe some of the phenomena, how this ecology of disaster created within the domain of education itself. I would largely classify this disaster, especially in the field of education, into broadly into three themes, right? One, look at the some of the policies, for example, the right to education, right? And this was a very revolutionary attempt by the policymakers. Thanks to the civil society in India, many movements were on forefront of this movement, and then we could make something like a legislative system to make sure that education should be a fundamental right, right? And the second one, a clear, a tacit reading of a NEP, the 2020 National Education Policy, would also tell us that how a new policy also undermine the very essence of right to education, right? And not only with regard to right to education, but also the entire structuring of the education system also somehow dubious design to destroy the entire system of education. It is also coupled with some other issues. For example, look at the new education policy and the new regime called NTA, right? National Testing Agency. And this is another new phenomena that has just evolved out of the NEP. I don't know whether the NEP, the National Testing Agency, as a new regime, is a design of the NEP or it's an arbitrary decision of the government, right? This is very interesting to look at how policy deliberations also undermining the existing revolutionary attempts to change the system of education, to make education more affordable, right? It can be, should be more affordable. it would be a public good, so on and so forth. At the same time, the policy also undermining these are some of the revolutionary ideas or very progressive ideas to make education much more democratic, egalitarian, so on and so forth. Right. And the fourth dynamics to this kind of a problem, to my mind, is that the poor governance of the education. No matter whether it is a coaching industry or it's a private sector or it's a public-private model of institution now coming up, because state thinks that the funding cannot be continued for long because of the market interventions. Even the public funded institutions are also poorly governed. So the poor governance of the institution and the more regulations on the institutions. I think the more and more regulations would come on to the coaching industry also, because the latest report also suggests that the government of India is very much concerned about the problems of the coaching industry. Therefore, the poor governance as well as the more regulations would much more complicate the system of education, including the coaching industry. Right. So these are the set of policy deliberations and the kind of the disaster over a period of time, the policy makers as well as the policy think tank talking about in terms of how to reform the educational system through different mechanisms, right? NEP is one such of mechanism through which they are trying to operate it. At the same time, it's also undermined the existing policies which are much more progressive in terms of how to deal with some of the questions like inequality, right? Educational facilities, access to education, quality education, so on and so forth. And the second set of disaster to my mind is the level of doctrination, something called a new kind of indoctrination by other means, because somehow educated lot are not adequately patriotic. Understand, education means we should be patriotic to begin with or to end with, right? Somehow the policy deliberations outside the policy deliberations, although political, certainly it is also an ideological, right? The policy also driven by certain ideologies of the political parties in power or parties outside of the power, so on and so forth. This is also a dilemma to look at how a new indoctrination also by different means try to regulate education as well as the public mind at large, right? For instance, some of the incidents to my mind that look at the hijab controversy in Karnataka, right? Communal polarization. Some of the university campuses become almost like a war zone. The students were also being disturbed. Students' activities were also disturbed. The political articulation of the students were also disturbed. The outside of the university campuses, you know how public lynching takes place. Cow vigilante, right? The aggressive forces of something called a new idea called the Hindutva identity that is also largely perpetuated through different mode of what I said, indoctrination to the mind of the public at large. So this indoctrination of some kind of an ideology which is prevalent or which is considered to be very more prevalent, more traditional, more, what I say, more of our own tradition, is also creating some kind of a psychological impact on the average citizens in this country, right? Therefore, inside or outside of the educational system, those who study, those who start logically thinking about the future of their own life is also disturbed by some kind of this notions called, many students would feel that they are not adequately conscious, they are not adequately aware about the idea called patriotism. Just saying that I'm a citizen of India is not adequate to say that you are a patriotic. Through other means, there is an indoctrination of certain particular values imposing upon the students would also create fear, right? The future of the students also driven by a large number of these disturbances while they study. For instance, look at why this hijab controversy in South India, especially in Karnataka. It is very clear that students, especially among the Muslim communities, the students, women's participation growing in Southern India, right? Students, girl students are studying more. They are also participating in higher educational institutions. So data would tell that how over a period of time, the cultural demography and the participation of education system also changing, right? And this also give a new signal to understand how the system of education changes in the future, right? And therefore there is an internal fear among these so-called indoctrinators of particular ideology or indoctrination of different means to just also given a new direction that those who come to the education system first time in the history are also not adequately equipped or aware about their patriotism, right? This something called deficiency to understand this patriotism is also a deeper psychological impact on the students coming from different social background, right? This one, to my mind, also create a lot of tensions in terms of choice making, right? This also constrains students to move. Spatial mobility also disturbed because I remember many students from South India call me, their parents also call me and say that, sir, is it safe for sending my children to JNU? Right? I lived in Jammu and Kashmir almost 10 years. I was also teaching in a university. So many of them know I am here in JNU, right? Some of the parents would call me. So this is what to my mind, that the new sense created in the mind of the public, that this kind of an indoctrination also create a fear in the mind of the youngsters parent to look at the new possibilities of education that are available in the public funded institutions. So therefore there is a constraint, right? And these constraints are largely structural in nature. I don't consider it so almost like a personal problems, right? And then we are trying to psychologize the problem, that to diagnose what is the root cause of the problems. And the third set of problems, so as I come close to what Nuria, student of economics, she would be better informed about these problems, but I would also flash it up in the sense that look at the political economy today, and especially on political economy of education, right? I was looking at the report in 2018, how the education ministry and the entire education system, right, made a very poor financial management. It is reported that educational cess collected by the government remained unspent. It's coming around 900 crores rupees. Right, over a period of time, you also realize the fact that the fund has come, but it has not been utilized. Right, where does this fund go, and who is responsible for that? Right, nobody knows that public funds are available, but it's not utilized. It remains underutilized in education. Right, huge amount is underutilized. Right, therefore, the poor financial management within the education, especially public funding, has been not properly utilized by the ministry, the concerned ministries. Right. Not only that, but also look at the economic crisis. One side we have resources, but that has not been utilized properly. Second, the economic crisis also created a jobless growth. So one side, the economy promises that there will be a growth, but this growth is actually constraining or limiting the possibilities of having more jobs. So once students get admission or pass out from any institutions, so what is the possibility of any kind of occupational mobility for them? Most of them remain unemployed, right? This also creates deeper psychological impact on the students who at least completing their studies and then waiting for the job, right? And this waiting for the job is now going to become huge number. As a result, we don't know how this educated demography is going to be dealt with either by the policymakers or the new economic regime that is growing, what we call it as a fast economic growth, right? And this also, to my mind, the economy is something we consider, or the policymakers consider, it's a liberal economy, right? After 90s onwards, the economy turns out to be something global in nature. Its growth rate is tremendous to look at how we can compare or defeat the rest of the world, right? And how our economy is going to be more competent because of this liberal nature of the economy. But at the same time, the liberal nature of economy also is more of a conservative paradigm, right? So 2 days back, the IMF director, the Geeta Wish, so someone who came to Delhi University, and then she was saying that we need a very systematic, detailed account on the economy, because we have not adequately understand the new economic problems which India faces today, right? And then what we have been doing then. So the detailed account of what economic behavior today, the political economic behavior today, needs to be revisited, right? We need a much more detailed account on how economy is performing, because now it's very so far clear that inequality is widening in India, especially on economic inequalities. Right. Therefore, the political economy of education and the larger economy surrounded by this educational system is also somehow related to how we look at education, as well as the cost, this not only economic cost but also the social cost, a burden to the every household in the country. Right, every household is now disturbed by the cost of living. Similarly, the cost of education. The study also showed that the domestic cost, the family, individual cost on education, other than what government is spending, is also growing very fast. Right? Maybe 1/4 of the total expenditure on education may be given by government. Otherwise, rest of the responsibility of taking care of everyday expenditure of every student is met by families, right? So therefore, families are overburdened. We somehow undermined in our research that the families are also somehow overburdened by the new political regime, as well as the political economy of education, right? So now money becomes very important component, because if you have a money, somebody holds the money, then it can be also somehow uh, recent study in Bihar also tells us that so there is a group called they accumulate a wealth, right? And they accumulate the wealth, and they are also ready to spend as much as possible for education, right? Every city got a this kind of a group, perhaps now also identifying, and they're also ready to spend on education, especially on creating new ecosystem called educational hub. It may be perhaps even there is a new set of network coming up. People from abroad also coming, having a international standard educational system in different cities in India, right? So it's a high fee. Schools are also coming up along with the low school fee. One of my colleague also did a very extensive study on how low private schools are growing in the villages in India, right? Similarly, this also happening in the urban cities, where the high fee schools are also growing very fast, right? So therefore, the privatization is not merely in the urban center, but also it is in the rural areas, and also creating market and the profit making, right? Therefore, the children coming from poor background, the family belongs to different social settings, right? Poor economically background families cannot afford this kind of a new system of education that is much more, right, uh, costlier as well as profit making. Right. These are some of the political, economical consequences that actually brought into the somehow stressfulness in the mind of the children as well as the families. Right. I will just finish it. Another set of problems to my mind is that look at how educational systems in India are internally fragmented, right? You have a private sector, you have a PPP model, we have government fully funded institutions. Now, fully funded institutions were asked to start self-financing courses. And many colleges and universities have come across, even in South India also, right? So there are variety of management systems, financial management of education institutions, which themselves are fragmented. And students also somehow, not only largely, students are also confused when it comes to the question of choices. They don't know which institution and what would be their choice in terms of choosing an institution or taking up any particular discipline or an area of research or for their career growth, so on and so forth. These institutions are also diversified. At the same time, they are also fragmented in terms of how the financial management of these institutions arrange, as well as the profit making, right? So the public, other than public funded institution, the rule of the game of all these private agencies of different kind, because some are fully managed, some may be philanthropic, right? Some may be PPP model, private and public partnership models. This also somehow creates a confusion, right? A dilemma in the mind of the so-called the choice makers, right? So getting all these, what I say, the ecology of disaster, when you look at the entire spectrum of education, I fail to understand what mean to be education, right? We Are we really losing the sense of what to be educated or what mean to be educated, right? Therefore coaching industry to my mind is one of the symptoms, right? I don't find it is a cause. It is one of the symptoms, that symptoms created by what, the ecology of the disaster called the current educational system following today. So with a brief my own understanding about education and stuff, and I am keen to um, mm, listen to some of the responses or reactions. Also, that would be great to understand how the participants would look at the problems. Thank you, Roshan. Thank you, the audience. Thank you, those who participated and attended this discussion.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for shedding light on how the education system present in India and what should it be, how the coaching industry is seen as a symptom for the disastrous education as per your view, and how it's impacting the students even we had seen, and why these economic disparities are often seen, even how the coaching industry is growing in the rural sectors. All these issues sum up and towards the root cause how our education system should be and how it is now. What should be the changes should be made at the policy level? Should it be blended towards the complete public sector? Whether this public-private partnership is creating an issue, or this privatization is becoming a rampant commercialization. So, to answer these things, we will continue this series of commercialization of education in future. So now the house is open for the audience and students. You can come up with your questions either through chat box or directly through audio.
Uh, can I ask my question?
Yes, Ankita, you can.
Yes, sir. Sir, I am Ankita, research scholar at Central University, Gujarat. My research topic is professional identity of school teachers and private tutors. Sir, I was wondering, since you pointed out that India has not made good use of our demographic dividend, sir, does that mean, and that has somehow caused the rise of the coaching industry, sir, does that mean if we somehow fix the link between education and jobs, would coaching institutes go down? because of the high stakes examinations that we have, students want to crack these examinations because they believe they'll get into good colleges, and when they get into good colleges they'll get good jobs. So if we increase the number of jobs, if we fix that aspect, would it lead to lower coaching phenomena?
Roshan, should I respond to the question, or should
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I respond to this question?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Angita. Yeah, so wonderful. So we are really thinking about. Yeah, one of the issue we all are concerned about as a researchers or teachers, our concern certainly is a demographic dividend, right? So youth population, and then this is one of the most creative, uh, useful, right, resourceful resource for the country, right? And we have to utilize it. That's what perhaps Professor Manmohan Singh, when he was Minister of Finance Minister, and he went to build bank, and because first time he thought about how we should make use of this demographic dividend, right? Then there was some kind of a thought process coming up in the policy, in the minds of the policy makers, that we should expand the higher education systems, right? We saw, say, 15 years back or 20 years back, the kind of expansion happened in the education system, certainly because of looking at how we can creatively utilize this demographic dividend. Right. Having said so, this also, what the policymakers were also thinking, that the resources may not be adequate, right? As a result, we have to, in order to expand these avenues, we should also open the other possibilities, right? That's why the privatization or PPP model came in. And there are a lot of consensus among the policymakers also, because we don't have much of resources. And also there was some kind of a cynicism among the policymakers that the public funded or public financing on higher education is not more effective for education, for the future of economy, right? It's all may not be contributing the way we think about, right? Because there's a cause and effect analysis for in the mind of the economist, right? As a result, in order to make more competitive, right, and also somehow thinking that the user friendly type, right, those who are availing the education can also financially support the system of education, right? This is one of the consensus that developed during those period when they brought about the PPP model. One side is that ideologically speaking, there is a withdrawal of the state and the arrival of the market, right? But the consensus was that the public funding education is not going to contribute much to the economic growth. It also burdening the public exchequer, right? And this cynicism also created some kind of a consensus among the policymakers to invite the public sector, right? And then you can look at the Abani reports way back in 1993, right? And so they invited corporate sectors to study and then give a new direction to the policy. Therefore, there's a new type of a collaboration, or a kind of a convergence of the public and the private, right? So now your question is very valid question, in the sense that more and more educational avenues would certainly logically speaking, reduce the burden of coaching centers, right? And this can also be, why don't we look at the other way around? This also by grand design, right? I don't know whether the new policy, some new regulation on coaching industry saying that we should stop. No, they want more regulations, right? It's not doing away with the coaching industry. Therefore, by design, let the coaching industry continue with the regulations, right? That what does it mean? Right? So creating much more burden to the public and every family, right? So we are looking at the demographic dividend, but at the same time, our policies are not progressive to the way in which it actually address the demographic dividend, right? We should have more educational institutions. So you know what is the outlay, financial outlay or budget outlay for higher education over a period of time to reduce, right? So we do not have adequate resources, right? And the other side of the spectrum is that I am very critical about myself and part of the educational system. Our institutions are also weak, right? We do not have very quality institutions. So when we critically look at our own educational institutions, this is also one of the way looking at how we see our institutions also progressing through their own understanding about education and the economy of the future. Right. Therefore, one kind of a logic to my mind is that if you allow economy to determine the future of education, right? I'm giving a perspective. If the economy determines the future of education, you can just look at the how market is going to thrive, or the education look at the future of economy, how it has to grow, right? So therefore, as an educationalists and intellectuals, perhaps our perception and perspectives are very important, right? So the market is always looking at, and we are also the policy makers also thinking about market is going to rescue most of the problems, right? So far it has not been. That is why we need to strengthen the state system, public funding on educational system, and we need a quality education. Still, we need a expansion of institution. Still, we need to improve the quality of education. There is no doubt about that. So I am stand with that point that the public funding as well as the expansion of the avenues still need to be a very critical for India as an emerging economy. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. S. Mohammed Obaidullah.
First of all, thank you all of you. So first of all, I want to ask question from Nuria ma'am. Nuria ma'am, I earlier had three questions from you. Number one, when we look at the whole coaching industry, we see that comparatively the coaching industry for masters, for students who want to do masters in different field, uh, they like those type of coachings have been less commercialized, and they have not been that much have been privatized. If you can look at the coachings for GATE or even IIT GEM, you will come to know that fees of these coachings have been very low since a very long time. My second question is, you just hinted about the point that the policy that had government had just launched, that the coaching, I don't know whether the age is 16 or 17, the coaching has been banned, like private coaching has been banned for those children. So don't you think that is that the violation of Right to Education Act? Because there is a complete block who think that it is a violation of right to education. How can someone? So I just want you to briefly comment on it, and what is your take? My third question was about what is the complete solution to it, but Suresh sir has already answered it. So I want you to comment on these two questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't. You mentioned about banning of coaching institute, right? Which coaching institute? Could you please elaborate a little on your second question, please?
Ma'am, it's almost 2 to 3 months. I don't remember this. The government launched something. I don't know, it was a policy or something. I don't remember. Where there is an advisory where students who are below than 17 or 16.
Yes. Okay. All right. I understood. Yes, there was an. All right. Okay. Coming to your first question, that masters for GATE and these are the level of privatization is less. Yes. Maybe number of aspirants are less. Probably that could be one of the reasons. People pursuing masters, and also before NTA, if you see earlier, based on the marks that you get in your graduation, the universities were conducting their own entrance examination, respectively. So I remember we would fill forms for respective universities in which we would like to apply, and then they would take their own entrance examination. So every university would have their own. So that is why maybe students would take previous year's question papers and then prepare for the But when it also, I think by that time, students also kind of learn to understand the system. They are kind of little bit mature than what they were during the school, and there is a drastic difference between school level, they are teenagers, and then suddenly the pattern changes to pre-engineering and just JEE, NEET. No, there's a drastic difference between the examination pattern. And you also look at the demand, as I mentioned, the seats and the aspirants. They're in lakhs. So I'm sure it's not a very old new notion that engineering and medical field will fetch you a good job. This is a very old notion that we have in our families, that okay, you take sciences and you'll be able to do better in your career. Hence the very idea that one will become a doctor or an engineer and will enter into a will get a good job is something which is very common amongst our families. Not many would know vis-a-vis this about GATE and other options. This could be one of the reasons. About regulation, about your second question, yes, the Ministry of Education that came up with the guidelines on regulation on coaching industry, they only said that yes, students below 16 years are not eligible to take coaching. So basically in quota only this happens that, student right from the 6th standard or 7th standard they're preparing for, either Olympiads and other exams. So they want, so that by 8th or 9th, they are ready to full-fledgedly practice. And they're basically ahead of their peers also in terms of the preparation, because what they want to do is they have already decided, or the parents have already decided they want to go for engineering or medical. So this is one of the points that was mentioned by the document. In the document this is mentioned, but again, as I mentioned, these are mere guidelines. Now it is up to the state whether they will put it or not. It is up to the state of Rajasthan that the government wants to do it or not. So these are mere guidelines which the states can follow respectively as per the situation that is there. But these are only guidelines, so they're not liable that the everything will be shut from tomorrow onwards. So which is why I said that yes, these guidelines have come up, but then how and in what intensity will they be applied is again a question that we have to really, the time will tell actually. I hope I have answered your questions.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
And there was one more question I had comment box.
Yes, please.
So how does the commercialization of education in India in comparison to global trends? Is there any unique factors in India, or it's the same across the global, like the commercialization of education?
Is it in the sorry, I'm so sorry. Is it in the chat box?
No, it was
How to
sorry.
save public
Yeah.
education and how to save government school? Is this the one you're talking about?
No, ma'am. It was to the host. Sorry, I was not visible. So, how does the commercialization of education in India compare to global trends? Are there any unique factors at play?
So commercialization of education of India as per global trends. If you talk about, if I take an example of shadow, yes, what is prevalent in what we see in private tuition, private coaching in East Asian economies like China, Hong Kong, the prevalence of coaching is huge actually. Before it actually had risen in India, it is very, very much prevalent. We take PISA tests and LSATs and others, and there also the level of competition among the students is extremely fierce. And actually, in the academic literature, if you see, then vis-a-vis, like in comparison to what the work has now been, we are, the academic work is now, the research is happening in this area. Much research is there in the context of China, Hong Kong, Japan, and other countries. A lot actually in Hong Kong, and there is regulation also with respect to education, because the level of stress that students go through in basically to compete in the entrance examination is again huge. So yes, when you talk about global trends, yes, the prevalence of coaching is there in other countries as well. Yes, in some countries it is quite like intense, in some it is not. But even in the if you talk about Denmark, let's say, if you talk about other European countries, there is a prevalence of if you talk African countries, some of the African countries also has. So the literature is there among in the area of shadow education, where they talk about the prevalence of private, basically shadow education, private tutoring industry.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Sir, there was a question to you. How do coaching centers impact the overall education equity in India, particularly for students from marginalized communities?
I was reading another question also, right?
Okay, sir.
Saeed was asking something like how to save the public education, how to save the government school, how to fight against educational privatization, so on and so forth. Yeah, so a list of problems, right? Saeed, to my mind, that see, one thing is that how us educated citizens, both those who are in the education system and outside also, that how do we articulate our own political presence in the education, right? Perhaps from 70s onwards, some studies show that the middle class attention on public education has changed, right? It's not a new phenomenon. This privatization is not a new phenomenon. If I told you just to go back into the history, 70s onwards, by 70s we got soon after the independence. By 70s, there was a bulk of middle class growing in India, and who were most of them are the beneficiaries of public funded institutions, right? But in the 70s onwards, the so-called the emergence of the middle class also somehow began to think about that this system of education is not good for the future growth of the economy. This is a very dubious argument, I would say. And I would say that there is a fear. Why the fear all of a sudden emerged in the so-called middle class in India, thinking about the privatizing education? What is that fear? Right. Therefore, the new logic of privatization got a bit of a historical understanding about how the policy makers, even the parliamentarians, were looking at some of the deliberations happening in the parliament. I wanted to chase what are the deliberations on education, serious deliberation taken place last 70 years. How long we took to at least to think about right to education. Even from the first policy on education also talking about, right? Education for all. Right? Education for all, everybody is talking about, but we do not have a policy. We do not have a consensus. Forget about the policy. We do not have consensus in the parliament. Our parliamentarians, educated lot, those who are a political voice, did not think about how to make education as a fundamental right from the beginning. We took almost 70, almost 65 years to make the policy possible, right? Therefore, to my mind is that we should have a very critical understanding about how the state dealt with the question historically, the political elites and the middle class looking at the education, right? The other side is that the bulk of the system, fortunately or unfortunately, it began to trickle down, right? 70s onwards, we see alternative voices coming up, those who come from, say, rural areas, different social groups. They also started demanding on higher education. That is why actually culminated into right to education, right? It was a people's movement. So therefore, people's voices also changed the spectrum of politics and the policy. To my mind, when I look at the entire spectrum of the movement behind right to education, certainly put a lot of pressure on the policymakers, parliamentarians, the middle class, right? It also shaken many of the so-called intellectuals to think very seriously about the future of education. Therefore, to my mind, to counter much of these untowards or destroying the system of education today, is because of our critical voices, right? And we need to still keep that momentum. We should continue with the critical voice because education matters for country like India. India is very poor country in terms of our educational infrastructure, right? In terms of the quality of education, we may economically grow, right? No doubt about that, because you may have a global flow of resources, but our population remains very poor in terms of quality of education, right? Still we need a school education, right? Look at the demography. So therefore, to my mind, it is very important to look at the critical voices continue to remain, and that actually creates rethinking about the future of education. That's also applicable to commercialization. It's also applicable to privatization. It's also sometimes related to how democracy as a new paradigm for a modern society should shape the future of education. Understand? Because there's also complementary each other. A good democracy needs educated lot, and the education is sustained because of the democratic. Otherwise, there is no meaning of a democracy. There is no meaning of education unless you have a democratic values, right? So, in order to sustain both the democracy and education system, we need to keep the critical voices, and that has to be sustained.